All right, we're going to look at the final author we are focusing on this course. In the Romantic epic, the Cockney poet John Keats. Keats was born in 1795 and died rather tragically at the age of 26 in 1821. He is one of the so-called second generation of the Romantic poets, very much influenced by William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, but obviously born 6 years after the French Revolution. And so having very much different life experiences than that of his predecessors. And the fact that he's also born in London also entails a very different experience in terms of his growing up and lifestyle than that of Wordsworth, who grew up in the Lake District and wrote so much about nature there. Nonetheless, Keats falls within the same, under the same umbrella as Wordsworth and his peers, in large part because of his emphasis on the imagination. So this is a watchword for all of the Romantic poets. And similarly, for the purposes of this course, at any rate, he also had a great interest in the epic as a genre. And we're going to look at 3 poems that I think engage, at any rate, either as epics or with some of the themes of the epic. So we'll look at Hyperion first, then the fall of Hyperion, both of them being epics and unfinished epics at that. And before finally, we will look then at his poem Lamia, which is more concentrated on the figure, the serpentine figure, which was the prominent emphasis in Coleridge's poem Christabel, which he'd plainly read and was engaging with. And with that, then the theme of the serpent and of illicit knowledge and all the sorts of things that come with the Miltonic themes in Paradise Lost. So Keats is again engaging with the same general themes and ideas of that of his contemporaries, and yet I think he adds things to the mix that are entirely his own and which warrant our attention, not only for that reason, but because he is himself a great poet. And some think that he would have gone on to be the greatest of the poets because of his natural poetic gifts. As I say, he died very young. Let me say a little bit about his biography before I get to discuss Hyperion. Keats was born on October 31st, 1795, first child of Thomas and Frances Keats, up in the north of London. His father worked for a rather prosperous man by the name of John Jennings, and he worked in the stables for him. Keats himself had other siblings, George, who emigrated to the United States. He was in Kentucky, I believe. Thomas, or as Keats himself called him, Tom, and his youngest sibling was Fanny. And she was the only one of the Keats family who managed to reach her an old age, died in Spain. If he had lived, of course, Keats himself would have been a Victorian poet, and we may have regarded him as a Victorian poet rather than as a Romantic, and that's just an interesting what would have happened had Keats lived on. Who knows? When he was 8, he went to school in Enfield. His father, just like Wordsworth's, was tragically killed, in this case in a riding accident, and his mother died of tuberculosis. So again, he was orphaned, and that was when he was 14 years of age, and the 4 Keats children were left with an elderly grandmother to look after them. So that in itself marks a feature of a common feature of some of the Romantics, at any rate, this loss of their parents. And we saw at least in Wordsworth, a quasi-autobiographical account in prelude that this was one of those spots of time which acquainted him with sublimity and so forth. He doesn't dwell on it too much. Keats doesn't dwell on it either. He doesn't write on it, but he does meditate in general in his poetry on mortality, on not only on mortality, but of sickness and of death. And that's not only because of his family circumstances, it's also because that he worked as a medical student when he was about 20. So 1815, he was at a place called Guy's Hospital as a medical student working there. He attended the lectures, he worked in the wards of the hospital, and that was the same age in which he started to write poetry more seriously. And this period was a very fertile one for him, but that the confluence of those two things, his work amongst the sick and the infirm, in combination with this love of poetry, the two go together with Keats. There's a great deal of reflection on sickness and illness and suffering and death that I think is makes his poetry unique, and which makes it less ethereal and less, to some degree, abstract than Wordsworth's poetry seems to be. He senses pain and the influence of suffering in his poetry and regularly meditates upon that topic. Furthermore, he was acquainted with it because his siblings also contracted tuberculosis and died, as did Keats himself. So Tom, so one of his younger brothers, Tom, contracted it, and when he comes to write Hyperion, he said that he felt obliged to write and plunge into abstract images, in part to deal with his awareness of Tom's illness. And for that reason, that is the abstract images and the Miltonic diction, he abandoned that poem and then came back to it again in his second bite at the cherry, as it were, in the Fall of Hyperion. But the idea of Hyperion was eminent in his mind. But this poem, Hyperion, which we'll look at now, was written, as I say, when he was nursing his sick brother, Tom. He writes about this in letters of the period, and Keats's letters are justly famous. And he does it to distract himself, and his attempt to write an epic is probably premature. And he acknowledges such in his letters. It was largely an exercise that he wanted to undertake at some point. Remember, he's around the same time, writing around the same age that Milton himself is considering writing an epic, but does not yet feel himself ready for such a poetic labor, the intellectual energy, the knowledge he will require, etc. He's not yet able to undertake. Likewise, Keats. Of course, Milton writes his epic when he's toward the end of his life in his 60s. Keats has to attempt it in his 20s. But he does it, as I say, to distract himself, and he does it following by and large the Miltonic diction, the inverted diction of Milton, which he later regards as inappropriate for him. And so Keats's grand style, as he develops it, and there are huge, if one were to look, if this were a poetry course on the Romantics in general, we look at the evolution of Keats's diction, moving from his early poems like Endymion to Hyperion, and then onwards. And there's a terrific process of maturation happening there, which is why many scholars and critics think that Keats would have been the greatest poet of his generation had he but lived long enough. Having said that, what he has written alone on its merits qualifies him as one of the great writers of his day. But it is written, as I say, in the idiom of Milton, and so you'll note very much the sort of language and even the the terminology that Milton will use, Keats picks up, and even to some degree, the versification of Paradise Lost. He is copying here. And this is actually, I think, a fascinating thing to observe for young people when they're themselves wanting to be writers. One of the pieces of advice I always give is, well, if you want to be a good writer, then read other good writers and be very attentive to not only the themes that they are occupying themselves with, but the language with which they do that, the syntax, the diction, even the form of versification, and consider it and copy it to some degree. Seek to emulate that standard, and then yourself, you will come up with your own voice along the way. But start with using not just the content, but the form that is there. And Keats is doing that as a young poet. And so that's another thing. We've talked about the romantic epic as the central focus of the course. And we note that the Romantics, for all of their desire to be novel and to be the great poets of their generation, as they saw Milton to be the great poet of his generation, nonetheless used a conventional form when they sought to run the flag up the flagpole of the great poets. They thought that they would do so only by the process of comparison. We would know that the Romantics were great epic poets by comparison with foregoing epic poets, and with the themes for that matter. So with that, what is the theme? Well, the theme is, as is typical of the Romantics, the growth of consciousness, the development of the grand march of the intellect, as Keats will, the phrase that Keats will use in one of his letters, that lies between Milton in the Protestant era, the sort of era of the Protestant Reformation, the Puritan Milton writing a theological epic, and yet the Romantics themselves believe that they have moved on from that time and are doing so in a way that is progressive, emancipatory, and advancing freedom. And I looked at that last time when we looked at Byron's Cain and talked about their the view from nowhere, to use Thomas Nagel's phrase, or to variously to describe it as their prejudice against prejudice, their belief that by moving away from the orthodoxy, the dogmatic features of Milton's poetry, they were advancing consciousness in a way that was more inclusive and less limited and less confining. And so when he writes on Hyperion, Hyperion is a Titan, and a Titan whose time is coming to an end. Now, let me say a little bit about the general outline of the poem. It's the Titans. Do I have this book here? Just give me 2 seconds here. Shelf. Or have I not got it on the shelf? No, I do not. Or do I? No, I don't. Stuck it somewhere else. So the what he has in mind is the account from Hesiod's Theogony, and he's basing this poem on his understanding that he's read clearly from Hesiod, or from secondary sources that are themselves basing their writing on Hesiod. And it's the account of the overthrow of the gods by a new generation of gods. So the Titans that he depicts here in the poem Hyperion are this group of gods, this pantheon of gods who are ruling prior to the Olympian gods. Now, the account of that, if you only read Homer, lies in the background. We find the Titans enchained, enslaved, tortured, tormented in the underworld by the Olympian gods. So the victorious Olympian gods have punished their enemies eternally in the underworld. And that's we see the consequence of a battle that had taken place. Keats in this poem is taking us to the time before that happens, in to some degree in the same way that Milton in books 5 and 6 tells us of a war in heaven in which Satan and a third of the angels in heaven take up arms against God, and then he overthrows them, and Satan and the angels are then sent to the pit of hell, which is how that epic begins. In the same way, Keats here is talking about the fall of the Titans, which predates or antedates the account in Milton in Homer's epics, where we see the Olympian gods reigning. But here is what happens before that. And as I say, to some degree, it's the account that we will find in Hesiod's Theogony. And so these Titans are ruling, and they are destined to fall. Now, who are these Titans? Well, among them, and they're listed here in the poem, are figures like Saturn, who's the king of all the gods, Ops, who is his wife, Thea, Saturn's sister, Enceladus, who's the god of war. And you can find in all of these gods variations on the following Olympian gods. So Saturn has a correspondence in what's his name? It's Jupiter's the Roman conception. Just drawing a blank here right now. Zeus. Ops would be the equivalent of Juno. Thea would be the equivalent of probably, good question here. Not exactly sure. Enceladus, though, would clearly be Mars, because he's the god of war. And Oceanus, the god of the sea, would probably be the equivalent of Neptune. Whereas Hyperion has the equivalent of Apollo. Now, all of these gods that were reigning in the Titanic form will be replaced by an equivalent god, and yet the equivalent god is not just a substitute, but an improvement upon the foregoing gods. And what we have here in Hyperion is a focus on the god of the sun, who's the one god that has not yet submitted or lost his power. And he will, in the end, in the poem, give way to his successor, whose name is Apollo. Now, Apollo is also the sun god, and simultaneously, as Keats well knows, the god of poetry, and connected with also with music and civilization and classical culture, which is a very interesting topic, and one that does not go away in the 19th century. It's one of the early interests of Friedrich Nietzsche in his work, The Birth of Tragedy, in which he talks about the interactions between Apollo, the god of poetry, with Bacchus, who's also a god of poetry, but is more prominently associated with tragedy. That's an interesting speculative work in its own right. But in the Hyperion poem, the poem begins with the central figure, who is now moving off the central stage, of Saturn. And Saturn is bemoaning the loss of his power, which is being usurped by his son, Jupiter. Now, in the account of Hesiod, this is an account of a degeneration. It's an account of a injustice, and it's account of how the universe itself bears all the marks of injustice, and that's from the very beginning, when the son rises up against the father. Note how Keats, in his rendering of this same mythology, inverts the assessment of this act. It is now not only an emancipatory act, it's a progressive act. So the replacement of the old gods by the new gods he deems to be a good thing rather than a tragic and unjust action. So he takes up the idea of the cyclical view of history, which we find in the pagan worldview. from the Golden Age to the Silver Age to the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. The Golden Age, by the way, in Hesiod's rendering would have had Saturn reigning, and the Silver Age begins at that point in which Jupiter rebels against his father and slays him. So this is the beginning of a degeneration by Hesiod's reckoning and by that of the whole ancient world. In Keats's rendering, it's the exact opposite. It is a move to a more just and more beautiful and more good age. And so he inverts the assessment of this cyclical time, and he is, by the fact that he's writing in the context of the French Revolution and the context of all the authors of the age, is putting himself alongside of progressive politics as well. But it's not so much politics that interests Keats so much as the humanities and poetry and what poetry will do. And for Keats, just like all of the writers of the era, poetry has something akin to a religious function, and the poet is akin to a prophet, bringing in a better golden age through poetry, which is revolutionary in the sense that it overthrows the orthodoxies and established norms of foregoing poets, and in particular, Mr. John Milton. So with all that said, let me come to the poem, and I will read some of the some extracts from book one. It's 3 books, but the third is rather abbreviated, but the most important of the 3. But we pick it up here with, as I said, Saturn. Saturn bemoaning this loss of power. And I'll read some of the lines here. So right from the outset. Deep in the shady sadness of a vale, far sunken from the healthy breath of morn, far from the fiery noon, and eve's one star, sat gray-haired Saturn, quiet as a stone, still as the silence round about his lair. Forest on forest hung about his head like cloud on cloud. No stir of air was there, not so much life as on a summer's day robs not one light seed from the feathered grass, but where the dead leaf fell, there did it rest. A stream went voiceless by, still deadened more by reason of his fallen divinity, spreading a shade. The naiad, mid her reeds, pressed her cold finger closer to her lips. Along the margin sand, large footmarks went, no further than to where his feet had strayed, and slept there since. Upon the sodden ground his old right hand lay nerveless, listless, dead, unsceptered, and his realmless eyes were closed, while his bowed head seemed listening to the earth, his ancient mother, for some comfort yet. It seemed no force could wake him from his place, but there came one, who was with a kindred hand touched his wide shoulders, after bending low with reverence, though to one who knew it not. She was a goddess of the infant world. By her in stature the tall Amazon had stood a pygmy's height. She would have ta'en Achilles by the hair and bent his neck, or with a finger stayed Ixion's wheel. Her face was large as that of Memphian Sphinx, pedestaled haply in a palace court, when sages looked to Egypt for their lore. But oh, how unlike marble was that face! How beautiful! If sorrow had not made sorrow more beautiful than beauty's self. There was a listening fear in her regard, as if calamity had but begun, as if the vanward clouds of evil days had spent their malice, and the sullen rear was with its stored thunder laboring up. One hand she pressed upon that aching spot where beats the human heart, as if just there, though an immortal, she felt cruel pain. The other upon Saturn's bended neck she laid, and to the level of his ear, leaning with parted lips, some words she spake in solemn tenor and deep organ tone, some mourning words which in our feeble tongue would come in these like accents. Oh, how frail to that large utterance of the early gods. Saturn, look up! Though wherefore, poor old king, I have no comfort for thee, no, not one. I cannot say, "Oh, wherefore sleepest thou?" For heaven is parted from thee, and the earth knows thee not, thus afflicted for a god. And ocean too, with all its solemn noise, has from thy sceptre passed, and all the air is emptied of thine hoary majesty. Thy thunder, conscious of the new command, rumbles reluctant o'er our fallen house, and thy sharp lightning in unpracticed hands scorches and burns our once serene domain. O aching time, O moments big as years, all as ye pass, swell out the monstrous truth and press it so upon our weary griefs that unbelief has not a space to breathe. Saturn, sleep on. O thoughtless, why did I thus violate thy slumberous solitude? Why should I ope thy melancholy eyes? Saturn, sleep on, while at thy feet I weep. This will be Thea, by the way, who speaks to him, his wife and sister. Saturn, in response to this, as when, and here we get an epic simile, as when upon a tranced summer night, those green-robed senators of mighty woods, tall oaks, branch charmed by the earnest stars, dream, and so dream all night without a stir, save from one gradual solitary gust, which comes upon the silence and dies off, as if the ebbing air had but one wave. So came these words and went, the while in tears she touched her fair large forehead to the ground, just where her falling hair might be outspread a soft and silken mat for Saturn's feet. At this, then, of course, Saturn lifts up his head. I'll skip a few lines down, lifts up his eyes and speaks as with a palsied tongue, line 94, and while his beard shook horrid with such aspen malady, O tender spouse of gold Hyperion, Thea, I feel thee ere I see thy face. Look up, and let me see our doom in it. Look up, and tell me if this feeble shape is Saturn's. Tell me if this wrinkling brow, naked and bare of its dark diadem, peers like the front of Saturn. Who had power to make me desolate? Whence came the strength? How was it nurtured to such bursting forth, while fate seems strangled in my nervous grasp? But it is so, and I am smothered up and buried from all godlike exercise of influence benign on planets pale, of admonitions to the winds and seas, of peaceful sway above man's harvesting, and all those acts which Deity supreme doth ease its heart of love in. I am gone, away from my own bosom. I have left my strong identity, my real self, somewhere between the throne and where I sit here on this spot of earth. Search, Thea, search, ope thine eyes etern, and sphere them round upon all space. Space starred and lorn of light. Space regioned with life air and barren void. Spaces of fire and all the yawn of hell. Search, Thea, search, and tell me if thou seest a certain shape or shadow making way with wings or chariot fierce to repossess a heaven he lost erewhile. It must be of ripe progress. Saturn must be king. Yes, there must be a golden victory. There must be gods thrown down, and trumpets blown of triumph calm, and hymns of festival upon the golden clouds metropolitan. Voices of soft proclaim and silver stir of strings in hollow shells. And there shall be beautiful things made new. For the surprise of the sky children, I will give command. Thea, 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 where is Saturn? So what we find here is, as I say, the loss of power being bemoaned by Jupiter, and not only his sense of his loss of power, but his puzzlement at the fact that it is so. How did this actually transpire? And with this, we see something along the same lines as the setting with which we began in, or last in Shelley's Prometheus Unbound, with a similar Titan being chained upon a rock, in that case Jupiter, and clearly then a later rendition, because now Jupiter, who's the usurper here, is now being usurped by a similar god. So we get it in both cases, a return to pagan mythology, and yet a novel interpretation of that. So the mythology takes a turn. So they're not explicitly, unlike Byron, who in his Cain is explicitly engaging with Christian theology and getting in trouble for it. Here they're engaging more with the account of history and how it relates to myth, and how it further relates to poetry, and how it finally relates to the romantic project of the imagination as a faculty that not only liberates, but brings about progress. And they're telling it in terms, again, of the classical world rather than of the Christian per se. But we will see that features of the Christian epic remain there in the features of this. But so we left off with the question by Saturn of where he has gone, because he has fallen from his throne. He's no longer seated there. He is on the ground. Who has taken his place? He doesn't ask that, but he says that the god must still be somewhere on the throne, somewhere, and that it must be furthermore good. There must be a golden victory. Saturn must be king. It's unthinkable that it should be otherwise, and of course it might be unthinkable, but it has in fact transpired. And this passion, Keats goes on, 136, lifted him up on his feet and made his hands to struggle in the air, his druid locks to shake and ooze with sweat. So now Keats is conflating pagan Britain with pagan Greece in the account. That's okay. But just note that he is doing so. His eyes to fever out, his voice to cease. He stood and heard not Thea's sobbing deep. A little time, and then again he snatched utterance thus. But cannot I create? Cannot I form? Cannot I fashion forth another world, another universe, to overbear and crumble this to naught? Where is another chaos? Where? That word found way unto Olympus, and made quake the rebel three. Thea was startled up, and in her bearing was a sort of hope, and thus the quick-voiced spake, yet full of awe, this cheers our fallen house. Come to our friends. O Saturn, come away and give them heart. I know the covert, for thence came I hither. Thus brief. Then with beseeching eyes she went with backward footing through the shade a space. He followed, and she turned to lead the way through aged boughs that yielded like the mist which eagles cleave up mounting from their nest. The rebel three, by the way, are Jupiter, Pluto, and Neptune, the three that had risen up against their father. Meanwhile, in other realms, big tears were shed, more sorrow like to this, and such like woe. Too huge for mortal tongue or pen of scribe, the Titans fierce, self-hid or prison-bound, groaned for the old allegiance once more, and listened in sharp pain for Saturn's voice. But one of the old mammoth brood still kept his sovereignty and rule and majesty. Blazing Hyperion on his orbed fire still sat, still snuffed the incense, teeming up from man to the sun's god, yet unsecure. Now the reference here, note that in the Greco-Roman epics, the gods breathe in the oblations, the sacrifices being given to them, the burnt offerings, and it's a pleasing smell to their nostrils. Keats is conflating that with the snuff that is habitually used in this era by the aristocracy. A sort of little pinch of tobacco. It's snuff creates a little head rush, and making clearly political insinuations in the epic here. But again, this is characteristic of literature, that it does engage with political themes. I think there's more than politics at work here, but nonetheless, it is clearly political. He has the snuff, as I say, and Hyperion is the figure of a monarch who has not yet fallen and is angry and yet unsecure. We read 168. For as among us mortals omens drear fright and perplex, so also shuddered he. Not at dogs' howl, or gloom birds' hated screech, or the familiar visiting of one upon the first toll of his passing bell, or prophesyings of the midnight lamp, but horrors, portioned to a giant nerve, oft made Hyperion ache. His palace bright, bastioned with pyramids of glowing gold, and touched with shade of all bronzed obelisks, glared a blood red through all its 1,000 courts, arches and domes and fiery galleries, and all its curtains of Aurorian clouds flushed angrily, while sometimes eagles' wings unseen before by gods or wondering men darkened the palace, and neighing steeds were heard, not heard before by gods or wondering men. Also, when he would taste the spicy wreaths of incense breathed aloft from sacred hills, instead of sweets, his ample palate took savor of poisonous brass and metal sick. And so, when harbored in the sleepy west, after the full completion of fair day, for rest divine upon exalted couch, and slumber in the arms of melody, he paced away the pleasant hours of ease, with stride colossal, on from hall to hall, while far within each aisle and deep recess his winged minions in close clusters stood, amazed and full of fear, like anxious men who on wide plains gather in panting troops when earthquakes jar their battlements and towers. Even now, while Saturn, roused from icy trance, went step for step with Thea through the woods, Hyperion, leaving twilight in the rear, came slope upon the threshold of the west. Then, as was wont, his palace door flew ope in smoothest silence, save what solemn tubes blown by the serious zephyrs gave of sweet and wandering sounds, slow breathed melodies, and like a rose in vermeil, hint and shape, in fragrance soft and coolness to the eye, that inlet severe magnificence stood full blown for the god to entered in. He entered, but he entered full of wrath. Let me hold off there and just make a comment. At this point, we come, as I say, to the account of the other gods, and the other gods sit in their miserable state, with the sole exception of Hyperion, who is defiant of the action that has taken place. And the other titans, nonetheless, sit in a state of misery. And they will discuss then, in the same manner in which we will see in Milton's Paradise Lost, there's an infernal council. The defeated gods lie, and they question at that point, what should they do? Should they seek to retake the power that has been lost? What should they do? And so forth. So I think, again, there's an echoing of some of the language and themes of Paradise Lost here in the fallen gods. They are to some degree in the same state as the fallen angels that we find in Milton's Paradise Lost. And what we find then in the account that follows is that the Titans are discussing whether they should fight back against the Olympian gods that have overthrown them. Oceanus declares that he's willing to surrender his power to his equivalent, Neptune, the new god of the sea. Why? Well, this is interesting. The reason that he gives for this is that Neptune is more beautiful than he. And this is part of Keats's theme in the account of the transformation and the progress brought about by the fall of one set of gods and its replacement by the other is the advancement of beauty and goodness and truth, but particularly beauty. So we get the, as I say, Oceanus willing to surrender his power because of the greater beauty of Neptune. Clymene, who hears the music of Apollo, also mentions that she finds Apollo's song so beautiful that it causes her pain. And this is telling and interesting because, again, now we get the dovetailing of the things that I mentioned to you at the outset, namely that the beauty of poetry is also connected with suffering and pain, a repeated topic of meditation by Keats, particularly in his spring odes, like Ode to a Grecian Urn, Ode to a Nightingale, Ode on a Grecian Urn, etc. In his later poetry, particularly the spring odes, we see Keats's thought at its most mature, hopefully, or had he lived, not yet quite arrived. But very interestingly, though, similarly to Shelley's rather Prometheus Unbound, a connection with the suffering of the character, with an unwillingness to seek vengeance, and an acceptance of pain, and to some degree an almost vicarious atonement on the behalf of Prometheus in Shelley's account. We find no such figure here in Keats's rendering. So in that sense, I think that Shelley's Prometheus Unbound engages more explicitly with the themes of Milton's Paradise Lost, where redemption is, of course, the central theme. But as I say, Clymene describes Apollo's music as so beautiful that it causes her pain. But the final figure that we need to mention here is the figure of Enceladus. Now, Enceladus is a fierce spirit, probably akin to Moloch, who wants more antagonism, more battle, and so forth. But Hyperion himself gets described in such terms as a figure that still possesses his power. And he is addressed by the figure of Uranus. We see other figures, by the way, who I should mention, one of them being most important, namely the figure of Mnemosyne, Mnemosyne, who is the goddess of the mother of the 9 muses. Her name means memory. And she will be then the goddess of the goddess who gives birth to the muses who are engaged to some degree in the same sort of project as Apollo himself, the god of poetry. So the god of poetry works with the daughters of Mnemosyne to bring about a new progressive poetic age. So that's what we have here. And Keats picks this up and carries this on. Where shall I pick this up? So Oceanus deliberates and passes over his opportunity. As I say, that's around line. So this is book 2, line 244. And Enceladus, on the other hand, in line 304, as I say, asserts and defies the overthrow of the Olympian gods, of the Titans' overthrow by the Olympian gods. So let me pick it up with some of his speech there at any rate. So the voice of falls away of Clymene, who hears the beautiful music of Apollo and cries out, and I'll echo her words here. So this is line 289. Grief overcame, and I was stopping up my frantic ears when, past all hindrance of my trembling hands, a voice came, sweeter, than all tune, and still it cried, Apollo, young Apollo, the morning bright Apollo, young Apollo. I fled, and it followed me, and cried, Apollo. O Father, and O brethren, had ye felt those pains of mine, O Saturn, hadst thou felt, ye would not call this too indulged tongue presumptuous in thus venturing to be heard. So far her voice flowed on, like timorous brook that, lingering along a pebbled coast, doth fear to meet the sea. But sea it met, and shuddered, for the overwhelming voice of huge Enceladus swallowed it in wrath. By the way, the reference to Apollo morning bright might have a reference to an implicit reference to Lucifer there. There might be an association with the beauty and the brightness of Lucifer, the morning star, the Lucifer here, but here it's in reference to Apollo and the beauty of his voice. But Enceladus does not receive this appeal to the greater beauty of Apollo's song well, and responds with wrath rather. And what does he say? The ponderous syllables, like sullen waves in the half-glutted hollows of reef rocks, came booming thus, while still upon his arm he leaned, not rising from supreme contempt. And he says this, or shall we listen to the over-wise, or to the over-foolish giant gods? Not thunderbolt on thunderbolt, till all that rebel Jove's whole armory were spent, not world on world upon these shoulders piled, could agonize me more than baby words in midst of the dethronement horrible. Speak, roar, shout, yell, ye sleepy Titans all. Do ye forget the blows, the buffets vile? Are ye not smitten by a youngling arm? Dost thou forget, sham monarch of the waves, thy scalding in the seas? What? Have I roused your spleens with so few simple words as these? Oh, joy, for now I see ye are not lost. Oh, joy, for now I see 1,000 eyes, wide glaring for revenge. As this he said, he lifted up his stature, vast, and stood, still without intermission, speaking thus. Now ye are flames. Now ye are flames, I'll tell you how to burn and purge the ether of our enemies, how to feed fierce the crooked stings of fire, and singe away the swollen clouds of Jove, stifling that puny essence in his tent. Oh, let him feel the evil he hath done, for though I scorn Oceanus' lore, much pain have I, for more than loss of realms, the days of peace and slumberous calm are fled. Those days, all innocent of scathing war, when all the fair existences of heaven came open-eyed to guess what we would speak. That was before our brows were taught to frown, before our lips knew else but solemn sounds. That was before we knew the winged thing. Victory might be lost, or might be won. And be ye mindful that Hyperion, our brightest brother, still is undisgraced. Hyperion, lo, his radiance is here. So if Hyperion is the sun god here and is not yet given in, there's yet hope for the gods, the Olympian gods, that they may yet, or rather the Titans, that the Olympian gods might yet be thwarted. And so all eyes were on Enceladus's face, and they beheld, while still Hyperion's name flew from his lips up to the vaulted rocks, a pallid gleam across his features stern, not savage, for he saw full many a god wroth as himself. He looked upon them all, and in each face he saw a gleam of light, but splendider in Saturn's, whose hoar locks shone like the bubbling foam about a keel when the prow sweeps into a midnight cove. In pale and silver silence they remain, till suddenly a splendor like the morn pervaded all the beetling gloomy steps, all the sad spaces of oblivion, and every gulf, and every chasm old, and every height, and every sullen depth, voiceless or hoarse with loud tormented streams, and all the everlasting cataracts, and all the headlong torrents, far and near, mantled before in darkness and huge shade, now saw the light and made it terrible. It was Hyperion. And he arises, and at this point, Hyperion cries out Saturn's name. I'll skip on just a little bit here. And they cry out, the four of the gods, Iapetus and Craeus and Phorcus, they stride forward and they cry out Saturn, old Saturn's name. Hyperion from the peak aloud answered, Saturn! Saturn sat near the mother of the gods, in whose face was no joy, though all the gods gave from their hollow throats the name of Saturn, words without any resonance and without any power. Then we begin book 3 with this, because now Hyperion arrives and the scene is going to shift to that of Apollo. And when we meet Apollo, we do not meet him in a triumphant posture. We do not see him angry. We meet him weeping. And this, as I said, in turn, reflects Keats' view of the victory that comes forth in replacement of the old conception of a vanquishing, intolerant, dogmatic religion, because the new god who replaces the old god is that of Apollo. In Apollo, we first meet weeping on the beach. And he is encountered by the goddess Mnemosyne, and he explains why he is crying. But let me get to this passage. I'm going to read an extended extract and I will comment on it. But this is the denouement of the whole plot here. And we will see the transformation take place in the figure of Apollo, famous words with which he does it as well. But let me begin. Book 3, line 1. Thus, in alternate uproar and sad peace, amazed were those Titans utterly. Oh, leave them, Muse. Oh, leave them to their woes, says the author. Keats interjects. For thou art weak to sing such tumults dire. Oh, a solitary sorrow best befits thy lips, and antheming a lonely grief. This is Keats' variation on the epic. Never mind the sorrows of battles and lost. His song is a solitary sorrow and antheming a lonely grief. This is Keats' variation on epic subject matter. Leave them, he says, O Muse, for thou anon wilt find many a fallen old divinity, wandering in vain about bewildered shores. Meantime, touch piously the Delphic harp, and not a wind of heaven but will breathe in aid soft warble from the Dorian flute. For lo, 'tis for the father of all verse, namely Apollo. Flush everything that hath a vermeil hue. Let the rose glow intense and warm the air, and let the clouds of even and of morn float in voluptuous fleeces o'er the hills. Let the red wine within the goblet boil, cold as a bubbling well. Let faint-lipped shells, or on sands, or in great deeps, vermilion turn through all their labyrinths. And let the maid blush keenly, as with some warm kiss surprised. Chief isle of the embowered Cyclades, rejoice, O Delos, with thine olives green. Delos is the island on which Apollo is said to reside. Often the word Delos, the island, is used as a substitute for Apollo. Rejoice, O Delos, with thine olives green, and poplars and lawn shading palms and beech, in which the zephyr breathes the loudest song, and hazels thick, dark stemmed beneath the shade. Apollo is once more the golden theme. Where was he when the giant of the sun, that is Hyperion, remember it's the Titans that have given way to the sky gods, when the giant of the sun stood bright amid the sorrow of his peers? Together had he left his mother fair and his twin sisters sleeping in their bower, and in the morning a twilight wandered forth beneath the osiers of a rivulet. Full ankle deep in lilies of the vale, the nightingale had ceased, and a few stars were lingering in the heavens, while the thrush began calm-throated. Throughout all the isle there was no covert, no retired cave unhaunted by the murmurous noise of waves, though scarcely heard in many a green recess. He listened, and he wept, and his bright tears went trickling down the golden bow he held, golden bow, pardon me, he held. Thus, with half-shut, suffused eyes he stood, while from beneath some cumbrous boughs hard by, with solemn step, an awful goddess came. This is Mnemosyne. And there was purport in her looks for him, which he, with eager guess, began to read, perplexed, the while melodiously he said, this is Apollo, "How camest thou over the unfooted sea? Or hath that antique mien and robed form moved in those veils invisible till now? Sure I have heard those vestments sweeping o'er the fallen leaves, when I have sat alone in cool mid-forest. Surely I have traced the rustle of those ample skirts about these grassy solitudes, and seen the flowers lift up their heads, as still the whisper passed. Goddess, I have beheld those eyes before, and their eternal calm, and all that face, or I have dreamed." "Yes," Mnemosyne replies, said the supreme shape, "thou hast dreamed of me, and awaking up didst find a lyre all golden by thy side, whose strings, touched by thy fingers, all the vast unwearied ear of the whole universe listened in pain and pleasure at the birth of such tuneful wonder. Is it not strange that thou shouldst weep, so gifted? Tell me, youth, what sorrow thou canst feel, for I am sad when thou dost shed a tear. Explain thy griefs to one who in this lonely isle hath been the watcher of thy sleep and hours of life, from the young day when first thy infant hand plucked witless the weak flowers, till thine arm could bend that bow heroic to all times. Show thy heart's secret to an ancient power who hath forsaken old and sacred thrones for prophecies of thee, and for the sake of loveliness new born." So ends the speech of Mnemosyne there. Note the back and forth on this, and this is interesting. There's an element of mystery in all of the questions here. Nobody ever gives a straight answer to how did this all happen. It all gets revealed. And so they can't look backwards, and this is characteristic of the Romantic epic and its progressive themes. They can't look backwards to tell of the cause of this effect, because there is no cause in the past. The causation comes in the future, because it's a progressive epic. The thing that is the greatest thing is as yet to come. And so when even Apollo himself is asked how this came about, he asked Mnemosyne how this came about, and she himself appeals back to him once again. Reveal this, and he says, reveal this. And so there's this sort of cyclical pattern here of calling upon revelation to explain what has already happened. And the explanation for it will not precede the actual event itself. So we are going to find out the meaning of history after the history's actually happened. And so thus the modern progressive age goes onwards, ever making what it calls to be progress, with yet nonetheless no logic or reasoning for it, but one that we should have to wait until the end of it, and then we will know exactly what has happened and why it has happened. So we're to put that question on hold, as it were. This is, to this day, progressive accounts, Whig accounts of history, appeal to, again, the goodness of the exercise, the greater beauty that comes as a result of it, and yet there is no actual explication of it, because that will reside in the provenance of the future to do that. So we see that characteristic not only of the Romantic epic as a whole, but particularly here of Mr. Keats. So back to the text. So we left off with Mnemosyne asking Apollo, and Apollo, who asked her the question not long before this, with this reply. Apollo then, with sudden scrutiny and gloomless eyes, thus answered, while his white melodious throat throbbed with the syllables. Mnemosyne, thy name is on my tongue. I know not how. Why should I tell thee what thou so well seest? Why should I strive to show what from thy lips should come no mystery? For me, dark, dark, and painful vile oblivion seals my eyes. I strive to search wherefore I am so sad, until a melancholy numbs my limbs. And then upon the grass I sit and moan like one who once had wings. Oh, why should I feel cursed and thwarted when the liegeless air yields to my step aspirant? Why should I feel spurn the green turf as hateful to my feet? Goddess benign, point forth some unknown thing. Are there not other regions than this isle? What are the stars? There is the sun, and the most patient brilliance of the moon, and stars by thousands. Point me out the way to any one particular beauteous star, and I will flit into it with my lyre and make it silvery splendor pant with bliss. I have heard the cloudy thunder. Where is power? Whose hand? Whose essence? What divinity makes this alarum in the elements, while I here idle, listen on the shores in fearless, yet in aching ignorance? Oh, tell me, lonely goddess, by thy harp that waileth every morn and eventide, tell me why thus I rave about these groves. Mute thou remainest, mute, yet I can read a wondrous lesson in thy silent face. And these famous words. Knowledge enormous makes a god of me. Names, deeds, grey legends, dire events, rebellions, majesties, sovereign voices, agonies, creations, and destroyings, all at once pour into the wide hollows of my brain and deify me, as if some blithe wine or bright elixir peerless I had drunk, and so became, or rather become, immortal. Thus the god, while his enkindled eyes with level glance beneath his soft white temples steadfast kept, trembling with light upon Mnemosyne. Soon wild commotions shook him and made flush all the immortal fairness of his limbs, most like the struggle at the gates of death, or liker still to one who should take leave of pale immortal death, and with a pang as hot as death's is chill, with fierce convulse die into life. So young Apollo anguished. His very hair, his golden tresses famed, kept undulation round his eager neck. During the pain, Mnemosyne upheld her arms as one who prophesied. At length, Apollo shrieked, and lo, from all his limbs, celestial ... And it does not conclude. The poem leaves off with the word celestial. And in his friend Richard Woodhouse, when he transcribed the poem, actually completed this line, celestial glory dawned, he was a god. But Keats leaves it off as this. His friend concludes with this. Note that Apollo is to some degree falling into the image of the Son in Paradise Lost, and likewise of Jesus in Paradise Regained. We have no direct confrontation with Satan like we would in the other two epics. And also we can note that the roles have been reversed. Apollo is deemed the challenger to the throne and is more true and thus more beautiful. So again, there's the two gods, or those that appeal for the superiority of their case. Here it doesn't come through a direct contrast or conflict even, let alone a direct personal interaction, but rather through suffering and through knowledge. It just comes upon him passively in a solitary fashion, and he is transformed into a god, almost through a sort of organic, natural process. And with that, let me conclude with these final thoughts on Keats' Hyperion and his contribution to the Romantic epic. Namely, that what he is presenting here in a way that I think is really very interesting is 60 years before Darwin's, or maybe 50 years before Darwin's Evolution of the Species. He's presenting something along the lines of a mythology that praises a new progressive age through a gradual process of evolution in which the superior rises out of the inferior, and in which we see genuine progress, not just simply change, but progress through this historical process. And as I say, even though it's pagan in its sense of engaging with the pagan deities, its interpretation of that change is entirely progressive, in keeping with what Darwin will later on suggest as a scientific progress, in which I have always found rather suspicious, if for no reason other than the myth precedes the observation of the facts. And I think it actually interprets them. It provides the rationale for interpreting them as Darwin then does, and believes that this is some sort of scientific progress, and takes the evidence and fits that theory in with it. But the theory and the beauty of the theory already predates the scientific account, which to my mind, as I say, questions something of the veracity of the entire theory. It's not a scientific theory per se, it is a worldview looking for a science to fit it. All the same, very interesting, and most certainly an excellent contribution to the Romantic epic, very different than some of the others, and yet following many of the same contours and themes that we've seen thus far throughout. And I will end with that, and next time we'll look at the fall of Hyperion, and also, as I said, his great poem Lamia.